Her jaw came away in the dentist's hand. She was 24 years old. She had been a watch dial painter for 5 years at a factory in Orange, New Jersey, where she sat at a long table with a small brush and a pot of greenish-yellow paint that glowed in the dark. She painted the numbers and the hands of watches, hundreds of them every shift, and she earned about a penny and a half per dial. To shape the tip of the brush, she had been told to draw it between her lips. Lip. Dip. Paint. That was the rhythm of the work. Her name was Mollie Maggia. By the time she died, in September of 1922, her teeth had loosened, her gums had ulcerated, and bone had crumbled from her mouth. The physician who signed her death certificate wrote down syphilis as the cause. She had not had syphilis. She would not be the last. This is a story about 3 factories, 2 lawsuits, and a question that mattered more than the answer. The question was whether a company could know that the paint it sold was killing the women who painted with it, and continue to sell it. The answer it gave, in the end, was yes. The radium paint had a name. It was called Undark, and it was made by the United States Radium Corporation, a defense contractor in Orange, New Jersey, that supplied luminous watches and instrument dials to the American military. The ore came from Colorado and Utah. The paint was a mixture of radium, zinc sulfide, gum arabic, and water. In daylight it was a pale, washed-out green. In the dark it shone with a soft, persistent light. To the dial painters, it looked like fairy dust. The plant employed around 300 workers, almost all of them women, most of them young. They were paid by the piece, between a penny and a half per dial. The brushes they used were made of camel hair, and they lost their shape after a few strokes. Workers were instructed to bring the bristles back to a point by drawing them between their lips, or with their tongues. The supervisors had a phrase for the technique. Lip, dip, paint. There was a second factory in Waterbury, Connecticut, supplying the Waterbury Clock Company, with the same paint and the same instruction. And in the early 1920s, a third one opened in Ottawa, Illinois, run by the Radium Dial Company. Its biggest customer was West Clocks, the manufacturer of the Big Ben alarm clocks that sat on bedside tables across the United States. The young women in Ottawa were told the same thing as the young women in Orange. The paint is safe. Point the brush with your lips. In all 3 towns, the workers painted their fingernails with the paint for fun. They painted designs on their teeth before going dancing. One woman, walking home in the dark, dabbed it under her eyebrows. They were never told not to. The men who ran the factory were not painting their own teeth. Behind the painting rooms, the chemists at the United States Radium Corporation handled radium with lead screens, lead aprons, tongs, and masks. The owners of the company knew, by the late 1910s, what the women at the long tables would not be told for another decade. They had distributed literature to the medical profession describing what they themselves called the injurious effects of radium. The inventor of the paint, a man named Sabin von Sochocky, would later die of poisoning by his own product. He was, by then, the 16th known victim. When the dial painters began to fall ill, the company hired its own doctors to examine them. Some of these doctors had no medical license. They told the women they were fine. When a Harvard public health researcher named Cecil Drinker investigated the plant and concluded that radium dust was saturating the workrooms, the company submitted his report to the New Jersey labor authorities with the conclusions changed to make the factory look clean. A colleague of Drinker's, Alice Hamilton, learned of the alteration. Drinker then published his unaltered findings, knowing the company had threatened to sue him. Inside the factory, the explanation given for the women's symptoms was syphilis. Doctors hired by the company were prepared to record it on their charts. The implication, the unspoken accusation, was that these were women of low character whose private lives had caught up with them. Mollie Maggia's certificate was one of many to bear this lie. It was a useful lie. It silenced families. It silenced churches. It silenced, for a time, the women themselves. Then one of them refused to be silenced. Her name was Grace Fryer. She had worked at the orange plant for a few years and had been promoted to a supervisor's position. Her teeth began to ache, then to fall out. Her jaw began to crumble. She decided that the company would have to answer for what it had done. To do that, she needed a lawyer. It took her 2 years to find one. The United States Radium Corporation was a major defense contractor with deep relationships in the New Jersey courts. No firm wished to take the case. When she finally retained counsel, the company's first move was to argue that the statute of limitations had run out. The poison had a slow timetable, and the law did not. By the time Grace Fryer's case reached a courtroom in January of 1928, other women had joined her. Their names were Edna Husman, Catherine Shaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Lais. The newspapers called them the Radium Girls, or the 5 Women of Orange. 2 of them were already bedridden. None of them could raise her right arm to take the oath. The trial did not run to its conclusion. In the autumn of 1928, the company settled. Each of the 5 women received $10,000, a pension of $600 a year for the rest of her life, and the promise that the company would pay her future medical and legal bills. All 5 were dead by the middle of the 1930s. In Ottawa, Illinois, the same story unfolded a decade behind New Jersey. The Radium Dial Company tried, for a time, to phase out the lip-pointing technique by issuing glass pens, but the workers were paid by the piece, and the pens were slow. They went back to the brushes. When the news from New Jersey reached Ottawa, management called the women into a meeting and told them the New Jersey women were lying. Some of the women in the room were, by then, already ill. Catherine Donohue had begun work at the Ottawa plant as a teenager. By the late 1930s she could no longer walk to the courthouse. She found a lawyer named Leonard Grossman who took the case for no fee. The hearing was held in her front room because she was too ill to travel. She testified from a chair, propped up. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor in the spring of 1938. By that time, the Radium Dial Company had quietly closed its Ottawa plant and reincorporated across the state line in New York. The commission did not pursue them across the border. The company appealed the ruling all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which on the 23rd of October, 1939, declined to hear the case. Catherine Donohue did not live to learn of the final verdict. She had died in her bed 20 months earlier. The Radium Girls did not see most of what their suits would build. They were dead, in nearly every case, before the laws written in their name had been signed. In 1949, the United States Congress passed legislation requiring that all American workers suffering from occupational disease be entitled to compensation. The labor reforms that followed, and the modern legal principle that a worker may sue an employer for harm caused by knowingly unsafe conditions, all trace, in part, back to these women. The right to sue for slow poison did not exist before them. After them, it did. Radium paint was not banned outright until the 1960s. The last factory making it closed in 1978. The very last surviving dial painter, a woman named Mabel Williams, died in Ottawa in 2015, at the age of 104. She had worked the line for years. She had never tipped the brush with her lips. She would tell anyone who asked that she had not thought it was a good idea. If you had stood at the head of a bed in a quiet ward at Argonne National Laboratory, outside Chicago, in 1968, you would have heard a soft, slow clicking. The instrument making the sound was a radiation detector. The body it was pointed at had been alive for more than 4 decades, and was still emitting alpha particles from inside the bones. Beginning in that year, the scientists at Argonne began a long program of measuring the bodies of dial painters, living and dead. By the time the project was wound down in 1993, they had collected detailed records on 2,403 cases. Exhumed remains were measured against living survivors. The data they gathered helped set the modern tolerance limits for radium exposure that still hold today. The bones of the women, in the ground or above it, were used to draw the boundary that protects everyone else. The bones are still there. The bodies are still detectable. The half-life of radium-226 is 1,600 years. A Geiger counter held above the grave of Mollie Maggia, in the year 3500, will still register her. The factory in Orange, New Jersey, was demolished. The soil beneath it was not cleaned until the 1990s, and remediation is, by the standards of nuclear engineers, still going on. The factory in Ottawa was bulldozed, and the rubble was used as fill-in roads, driveways, and the foundations of new houses, until the Environmental Protection Agency began locating and removing it in the 1980s. They are still finding it. In an earlier episode of Hollow Signal, episode 7, I told the story of a dam in northern Italy whose engineers knew the mountain above it would collapse, and filled the reservoir anyway. 2,000 people died. There is a thread that runs from Vagent to Orange to Ottawa. It is not a thread about accident or ignorance. It is a thread about knowing and continuing. The young women at the long tables believed the paint was safe because they were told the paint was safe by the men who had ordered the lead aprons for themselves. The watches the women painted were sold to soldiers and airmen and to families who set them on bedside tables. The watches kept good time. They glowed for hours after the lights went out. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. I cover the cases the world forgot.